All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff. You guys sent in this research by Craig H. Robinson, and, well, let's just say it's given us a whole new way to think about a part of the Bible that honestly always kind of freaked me out.
Yeah, Revelation can definitely be a head scratcher, but that's what we do here, right? Dig into the tough stuff.
Exactly. And sometimes the most well-known parts of the Bible are the ones we understand the least.
Totally. It's like we think we know it, so we kind of gloss over the detail.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Robinson is looking at those trumpet judgments in Revelation, chapters 8 and 9, the ones with all the hail and blood and locusts, the really apocalyptic stuff.
Right, the stuff that makes you want to hide under the bed.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. When most people read those passages, they immediately think of the plagues in Exodus, right?
Makes sense. Seems like a pretty clear connection. I mean, you've got similar imagery going on.
Right. Like, case closed. But Robinson is saying, hold on, there's a much deeper connection here, maybe even a more important one, going all the way back to Genesis, to the creation story itself.
Now, that's interesting. So instead of just judgments that mirror those in Exodus, what's he suggesting?
He's calling it decreation. Basically, he's arguing that these trumpet blasts are like a deliberate undoing of the order that God established in Genesis.
Whoa, decreation. That's a pretty intense concept, like hitting the rewind button on creation itself.
Right, and that's what we're going to explore today. What evidence does Robinson have for this decreation idea? What are the little hints hidden in the text? The themes, the structure, the language, all those little clues that connect these judgments back to Genesis.
It's like we're biblical detectives searching for clues.
I like that. And by putting those pieces together, maybe we can unlock a new way of understanding this whole section of Revelation.
Because let's be honest, Revelation can be a bit of a puzzle box sometimes.
For sure. All right, so Robinson starts by taking us on a little tour of how scholars have viewed this idea over time. And it turns out this Genesis connection isn't totally new.
Oh, really? So someone's noticed this before?
Yeah, back in 1977, a scholar named Jacques Ellul actually pointed out these allusions to Genesis, these little echoes. But he thought they were kind of rare, not a huge deal.
Interesting. So Ellul had a sense that Genesis was in the mix, but not as the main event.
Exactly. And he even talked about this decreation idea, specifically with the third, fourth, and fifth days of creation being undone.
Okay, so the seeds were planted, but not fully explored. What happened next in this scholarly journey?
Well, then in 1987, John Paulian, he did a much deeper dive into the Old Testament connections in Revelation. And as you might guess, he was mainly focused on the Exodus plagues.
Makes sense. That's kind of the go-to comparison.
Right. But he did identify some probable connections to the fourth and fifth days of creation in Genesis. But they were still kind of secondary to those Exodus parallels.
So Exodus was still the main lens through which people were reading this part of Revelation.
Exactly. And Robinson actually did a survey of a bunch of commentaries on Revelation, both older and newer ones. And guess what? Most of them acknowledge that, yeah, the trumpets affect creation, but only a small number specifically mention Genesis 1.
Huh. So even though the connection is there, it's like it was hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And even the commentaries that did mention Genesis, they usually only pointed to like 1, 2, or maybe 3 specific days of creation.
Okay, so not exactly a widespread recognition of this deeper connection. So how does Robinson go about building his case then? Like, how does he argue for this much stronger link to Genesis?
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. He basically says, we got to look beyond just a few little similarities. We need a more systematic way to evaluate these potential connections, to make sure they're intentional and actually meaningful.
Yeah, I can see that. You don't want to just be cherry picking verses that sound kind of similar. Gotta have some rigor.
Right. So he uses 6 criteria based on the work of other scholars to really put these connections to the test.
Okay, so it's like a checklist for determining if a connection is the real deal. What are some of the things on that checklist?
Okay, so one is the history of interpretation. Like, have other scholars throughout history seen this connection before?
So you're looking for some historical precedent. That makes sense. What else?
Then there's uniqueness. Is this a connection that is unlikely to have come from anywhere else? Like, is it a really specific link that points to Genesis 1?
Okay, so you're looking for those unique fingerprints that tie the two passages together.
Exactly. And then there's recurrence. Does this theme or passage from Genesis show up in other parts of Revelation?
Because if it does, that strengthens the case that John, the author of Revelation, had Genesis in mind.
Right. It's all about patterns, not just random coincidences. And the more of these connections we find, the more likely it is that they're intentional.
So the more echoes of Genesis we find in Revelation, the stronger the signal. What other criteria does Robinson use?
Well, there's also volume. Basically, the more words, phrases, and even sentence structures that overlap between the two passages, the stronger the case for a deliberate link.
So it's not just one or two words here and there, but a whole bunch of them. Quantity matters.
Right. Then there's thematic coherence. Do these connections actually share a core idea or meaning? And do they help us understand what John is trying to say in Revelation?
So it's got to make sense thematically. It can't just be a superficial word match. It has to fit into the bigger picture of what Revelation is about.
Exactly. And finally, there's authorial motive. Is there a logical reason why John would have included these references to Genesis? Does it make sense in terms of what he's trying to communicate to his audience?
So putting yourself in John's shoes, why would he bring Genesis into this apocalyptic vision?
Exactly. So it's about building a cumulative case. It's not just finding one little similarity and saying, aha, see? It's about showing a pattern of connections that are intentional and contribute to the overall message of Revelation.
Like those dot-to-dot puzzles, the more dots you connect, the clearer the picture becomes.
Right. And Robinson also makes a point of saying that when New Testament writers allude to the Old Testament, they often have a whole passage or story in mind, not just one single verse.
So we're going to zoom out a little bit, look at the broader context, not just get stuck on one tiny detail.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider Genesis 1 as a whole when looking at these connections to the trumpets.
So it's not just a word game, it's about understanding how the whole story of creation is being reflected and maybe even subverted in Revelation.
Right. And Robinson even uses a specific framework that helps us understand if the way the trumpet passage echoes Genesis, including any additions, changes, or things that are left out, if that was all intentional.
Well, that's interesting. So it's not just about what's the same, but also about what's different and why.
Exactly. And that can help us see how the trumpet passage interacts with Genesis 1 as a whole, like a conversation between the two texts.
Okay, so we've got the ground rules for this investigation. Now let's get to the evidence. What are some of the specific clues that Robinson uncovers, those direct parallels between Genesis and the trumpets?
Well, he starts by looking at those main realms of creation described in Genesis 1. Day, night, heaven, seas, and earth.
The building blocks of creation.
Right. And what's really striking is that each of the first 4 trumpets seems to directly target one of those foundational realms.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's a one-to-one correspondence. Tell me more about these parallels.
Okay, so the 4th trumpet, it brings darkness to the day and the night. The 3rd trumpet, a star falls from heaven. The 2nd trumpet, the sea turns to blood. And the 1st trumpet, hail, fire, and blood are thrown down to earth.
Wow, that's pretty direct. It's like each element of creation is being specifically attacked.
Right, and here's another really interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
The order in which these realms are judged seems to be the reverse of the order they were created in Genesis.
Reverse order. So it's not just the same elements, but they're being hit in reverse. That's got to be significant.
Exactly. Like, remember how the earth was formed pretty early on in Genesis?
Yeah, one of the first things God creates.
Right. But in the trumpets, it's the first to be struck. It's like the whole creation process is being played backwards.
Like rewinding a movie. Creation in reverse. Okay, I'm hooked. So we've got those main realms. What about the specific things within those realms, the individual elements?
He finds some pretty cool parallels there, too. For example, in Genesis, it talks about those waters above, which some people interpret as the clouds.
Ah, yeah, the waters that God separates from the waters below.
Right. And Robinson suggests those might be connected to the waters, rivers, and springs that are affected in the 3rd trumpet. Then you've got those fruit trees and plants from Genesis chapter 3, which seem to match up with the trees that are hit in the 1st trumpet.
So specific types of plants being targeted in both cases.
Yeah.
And didn't he mention something about a really specific word connection with the phrase green grass?
Oh, yeah, this is one of my favorites. So the exact Greek phrase for green grass is kortos chloros. And get this, it only appears twice in the whole Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Only twice? That's super rare. Where are those 2 appearances?
Once in Revelation 8.7, describing the grass being burned up.
Yeah.
And the other time, back in Genesis 1.30, where it describes the food God provides for the birds and animals on the 6th day of creation.
Whoa, that's more than just a general similarity. That's like a linguistic smoking gun.
Right. That incredibly specific connection really suggests that John had Genesis 1 in mind when he wrote that verse in Revelation.
I'm convinced. Okay, what other little linguistic fingerprints does Robinson uncover?
Well, there's another one with those greater and lesser lights, the sun and moon, and the stars that are created on day 4 of Genesis.
Right, the heavenly lights that govern day and night.
Exactly. And in the fourth trumpet, the sun, moon, and stars are all darkened. And again, there's a near unique use of this Greek word shine, or pheno, associated with them in both Revelation 8.12 and Genesis 1.1517.
So the very word used to describe their creation is echoed when they're being dimmed.
Exactly. And the only other time this combination appears in the Septuagint is in Ezekiel chapter 32, which itself is actually describing a kind of decreation event.
Okay, that's a pretty convincing pattern. What other elements of creation does he connect?
Well, he also points out that the sea creatures are described as having souls, or psychon, in both the second trumpet and on the 5th day of Genesis 1.
I don't remember sea creatures having souls mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. Is that unique to Genesis?
It's pretty unique. Another scholar, Pauliano, actually noted that Genesis 1 is the only place in the entire Old Testament where sea creatures are explicitly said to have souls.
So that makes a direct link to Genesis even more likely here.
Right. And then Robinson makes some potential connections between the winged creatures, or birds, from Genesis 5, and the locusts in the 5th trumpet.
Interesting. So it's not just any plague, it's specifically those flying creatures that he links back to creation.
Exactly. And he also links the land creatures, or animals, from Genesis 6 with the horses in the 6th trumpet.
Okay, so he's really going through those categories of creation one by one.
And of course, we can't forget about humans.
Right. Us. Where do we fit into all of this?
Well, humans are mentioned in the 3rd, 5th, and 6th trumpets. And while that in itself might not be super conclusive, Robinson argues that it contributes to this overall pattern, especially when you consider that a third of humanity is affected by the judgments.
Right, that same proportion that keeps popping up with other elements of creation, like
Yeah.
a third of the earth, a third of the sea, and now a third of humanity.
Exactly. It's like this deliberate mirroring of the proportions affected in creation.
Okay, so just with those verbal parallels, those direct connections in the wording, Robinson's already building a pretty strong case for an intentional link to Genesis. But it sounds like he takes it even further.
Oh yeah, he definitely doesn't stop there. He points out that those 3 main realms of creation, heaven, earth, and sea, they're mentioned together in relation to God's power in several other passages in Revelation.
Interesting. So it's not just in the trumpets that these realms are grouped together.
Exactly. You see it in chapters 5, 10, and 14. And even in the vision of the new creation in chapter 21, those 3 realms are mentioned together.
Okay, so that recurring emphasis on heaven, earth, and sea definitely points back to that foundational idea of creation, how God established those realms.
Right. And Robinson even notes that a couple of those passages, Revelation 10.6 and 14.6, they actually seem to allude to the 4th commandment.
You know, the one about remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy?
That's the one. And remember, the Sabbath is explicitly grounded in those 6 days of creation. So it's like those verses are subtly pointing back to Genesis and that creation story.
Okay, so the Genesis connection is woven into the very fabric of Revelation. It's more than just a few isolated verses. It's a recurring theme.
Exactly. Okay, so moving beyond those direct word matches, Robinson also looks at the thematic parallels. Basically, how are those core ideas and relationships that we see in Genesis being flipped or inverted in the trumpet judgments?
So not just what's the same, but what's intentionally different.
Exactly. And this is where those 5th and 6th trumpets really come into focus. So remember those key themes from days 5 and 6 of creation. The creation of distinct kinds of living creatures, the subgroups within those categories, the creation of humans in God's image, the blessing to multiply, the mandate for humans to rule, and the provision of food.
Right, all those foundational elements of the created order.
Exactly. And Robinson's argument is that those themes are all being systematically turned upside down in the trumpets.
Okay, so like a twisted reflection of those creation themes. Give me some examples.
Take the idea of distinct kinds of creatures. In Genesis, God creates very clear and separate categories, right? Fish in the sea, birds in the air, land animals on the land.
Right, each with their own unique characteristics and boundaries.
But in the trumpets, we see these grotesque hybrid creatures emerging, like things are being mixed up and distorted.
Like something out of a nightmare. What kind of creatures are we talking about?
Well, the locusts in the 5th trumpet They're described with faces like men, hair like women, scorpion tails, lion teeth. It's like they're cobbled together from different parts.
Yikes, that's unsettling. Definitely not the clean categories of creation.
Right. And the horses in the sixth trumpet, they're also described as these composite creatures with features of different animals.
Mm.
So that order and distinction of the original creation is being messed with.
Okay, so it's not just random destruction. There's this deliberate blurring of boundaries, almost like a mockery of the original created order. What about that blessing to multiply that we see in Genesis? Is that being twisted too?
Oh yeah, big time. So in Genesis, it's a blessing, right? Living creatures and humans are told to be fruitful and multiply to fill the earth.
Yeah, like a sign of God's favor and a continuation of life.
Exactly. But in the trumpets, a third of the sea creatures and a third of humanity are killed.
Whoa, so the blessing is turned into a curse. It's not life-giving anymore, it's death-dealing.
Right. And even though the locusts do multiply, they're not presented as a good thing at all. They're depicted as this corrupted, almost demonic form of life.
It's like a twisted version of that original blessing. And didn't Robinson also draw a contrast between the goodness of creation and the pronouncements of woe in the trumpets?
Yeah. So in Genesis, there's this repeated refrain that each day of creation is good, and then the seventh day is a day of blessing and rest. But in the trumpets, there's this repeated declaration of woe associated with those fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpets.
So it's like the opposite of that creation blessing. It's judgment and calamity.
Exactly. And what about that theme of human rule over creation? In Genesis, humans are given dominion over the earth and all the animals.
Yeah, that responsibility to care for and steward creation.
Right. But in the trumpets, that whole relationship is flipped on its head. The locusts, the horses, and this angel from the abyss, they're all given authority over humans.
Whoa, talk about a power shift. Humans are no longer in charge.
And not only are they no longer in charge, they're actually being tormented and killed by these creatures. It's like the created order has been totally inverted.
So instead of ruling over creation, humanity is now subject to these terrifying creatures. And what about the provision of food? How is that theme being twisted?
Well, in Genesis, God provides those fruit trees as food for humans and the green grass as food for animals.
Right, it's part of God's provision for life on Earth.
Exactly. But in the first trumpet, a third of the trees and all the green grass are burned up.
So the very source of nourishment is destroyed? That's pretty devastating.
Right. And then you get this really strange detail where the locusts are specifically told not to harm the vegetation.
Wait, what? The locusts, which are normally associated with devouring crops, are told to leave the plants alone.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And Robinson argues that this just emphasizes the complete reversal of the created order. The sources of nourishment are gone, but the agents of plague are restricted from consuming them. It's like this deliberate taunt,
Like a cosmic irony. The things that normally eat plants are told not to, while the things that need those plants are being destroyed. Okay, so across multiple key themes, Robinson is showing this pattern of inversion, of things being twisted and turned upside down. It's like a funhouse mirror reflection of creation.
Right. It's not just random destruction. It's a deliberate unraveling of the order and goodness of creation. And he also points to a thematic inversion with those waters above that we talked about earlier.
Ah, right, the ones that some people interpret as the clouds.
Yep. So Psalm 147 describes those clouds covering the heavens and giving rain to the rivers and springs, bringing life to the earth.
Like a cycle of blessing and provision.
Exactly. But in contrast, the third trumpet describes a star falling and making those same rivers and springs bitter and deadly.
So instead of life-giving water, it becomes poisonous.
Right. And Robinson also notes that the phrase springs of water appears in Revelation 14.7 in a clear creation context.
Right, connecting it back to that original act of God.
And then it appears again in the description of the new creation in Revelation 21 and 22.
Showing that pure, life-giving water is part of God's plan for the future.
Exactly. So the poisoned waters of the third trumpet stand in stark contrast to both the original creation and the promise of the new creation.
Okay, so we've got these verbal parallels, the direct connections in the wording, and we've got these thematic parallels, those core ideas from Genesis being inverted and twisted. But you mentioned that Robinson also talks about structural parallels. What did he mean by that?
So structural parallels are all about similarities in the overall organization or layout of the texts. Like, are there patterns in how the information is presented in both Genesis and Revelation?
Ah, so looking for connections in the architecture of the passages. That's fascinating.
Right. And actually, one scholar, Paul Ian, he considered these structural parallels to be some of the strongest evidence for direct illusion. So Robinson argues that those first four trumpets, they actually exhibit this reverse parallelism with the two half weeks of creation in Genesis.
Half weeks, you mean like days 1 through 3 and days 4 through 6?
Exactly. And remember that whole reverse order thing we were talking about?
Like how the earth is created early in Genesis, but is the first to be struck in the trumpets.
That's exactly it. So he lays out this really fascinating comparison. The first trumpet, which affects the earth, corresponds to day 3, the creation of land, and day 6, the creation of land, animals, and humans.
Okay, I'm seeing the pattern here. What about the other trumpets?
The second trumpet, impacting the sea, parallels day 2, when God separates the waters and creates the sea, and day 5, the creation of sea creatures. The third trumpet, with that falling star affecting the waters above and below, aligns with day 2 as well, when God creates the expanse of heaven and the waters above it. And the fourth trumpet, which dims the light of day and night, directly mirrors day 1, the creation of light and darkness, and day 4, the creation of the sun, moon, and stars.
Wow, it's like this perfectly mirrored structure, but in reverse.
It's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah.
But Robinson does acknowledge that there are some things that don't perfectly match up in this reverse parallel. He calls them unmatched items.
Unmatched items, like things that don't have a clear counterpart in the corresponding day of creation.
Exactly. Things like animals, humans, ships, and birds. They don't all fit neatly into that reverse structure.
Okay. So how does he explain those discrepancies?
Well, he uses that framework we talked about earlier to analyze these additions, omissions, and changes to see if they have any special significance.
Right, because even the things that are different can tell us something important about the connection between the two passages.
Exactly. So, for example, he suggests that the reason why land creatures and winged creatures aren't directly targeted in the first and third trumpets is because they show up later as those agents of judgment, the locusts and the horses in the fifth and sixth trumpets.
Ah, that makes sense. So they're spared in the initial judgments because they have a different role to play later on.
Right. And what about those ships in the second trumpet? They don't appear in the Genesis creation account at all. So how does he explain that?
Yeah, that seems out of place. Ships weren't around during the 6 days of creation.
Exactly. But Robinson connects it to Psalm 104, which is like a poetic retelling of the creation story.
Oh, interesting. And ships are mentioned in that song.
They are. It's the only non-created item mentioned in that whole poetic account of creation.
So he's saying that the inclusion of ships in the second trumpet is actually highlighting their non-created status, just like in Psalm 104.
That's exactly his argument. It's like a subtle wink to the reader,
A little literary Easter egg. I love that. What about the way humans are presented in this structure?
So remember how humans are directly created on the 6th day of Genesis?
Yeah, the culmination of God's creative work.
Right. But in the trumpets, they don't appear as victims until the third trumpet, where many are said to die from drinking that poisoned water.
That's different from what you might expect based on that strict reverse parallel.
Right. And Robinson suggests that this actually highlights the deadly consequences of contaminating a basic necessity for life, drinking water.
So it's not just about humans being punished, it's about the very sources of life being corrupted.
Exactly. And he also points out some subtle changes in the way green grass and humans are described in the trumpets compared to Genesis, suggesting that those basic sources of sustenance, food, and water are being both withdrawn and poisoned.
So even the slight variations from that strict reverse order aren't arbitrary. They're adding another layer of meaning to the decreation theme. And didn't Robinson also connect those unmatched items to the story of Noah's flood?
This is where it gets really mind-blowing. So he points out that those elements that don't fit neatly into the reverse creation pattern in the first four trumpets, those things like humans, animals, birds, and ships.
Right, the things that don't have a clear one-to-one match in the creation days.
Exactly. He says those are the same things that were preserved during the flood.
Whoa, that's fascinating. So the things that are spared in the trumpets are the things that are destroyed in the flood and vice versa.
Exactly. Like a mirror image. And he sees this as a subtle but deliberate allusion to that first great act of decreation in the Bible.
Okay, so now we've got Genesis 1, the flood narrative, and even Psalm 104, all woven into this intricate tapestry of the trumpet judgments. But Robinson doesn't stop there, does he? He brings in even more Old Testament stories.
Oh yeah, he's just getting started. While he acknowledges those clear connections to the Exodus plagues, with the hail and blood and darkness and locusts, he points to a couple of other important parallels as well.
Okay, so what other Old Testament stories does he bring into the mix?
Well, he highlights those echoes of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Ah, right, the cities that were destroyed by fire and brimstone.
Exactly. So in the fifth trumpet, it mentions smoke and a furnace. And then in the sixth trumpet, it mentions fire, smoke, and brimstone.
Now, that's a specific combination. I don't think you see those three things mentioned together very often in the Bible.
Right. It's a pretty unique triad that's primarily found in descriptions of that judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah.
So it's like John is deliberately using language that evokes that specific event.
Exactly. And he built on his flood connection by comparing those three Old Testament judgments, the plagues, the flood, and Sodom, and how they relate to this idea of decreation.
Okay, so how does he see those three judgments as examples of decreation?
Well, he argues that the flood is like a model of global decreation, the wiping out of almost all life on Earth.
Right, a complete reset button on creation.
Exactly. Then you have Sodom, which is more like a localized decreation, focused on those specific cities.
Like a microcosm of that global destruction.
Right. And Robinson even suggests that the structure of that judgment, the way it unfolds, might actually mirror the first 3 days of creation in Genesis.
Wow, that's interesting. So even in the act of destruction, there's this echo of the original creation.
And he also points out that theme of God remembered that pops up in both the flood and Sodom narratives, suggesting that even in judgment, there's this hint of future restoration and recreation.
It's like a reminder that God's plan isn't just about destruction, but also about renewal and redemption.
Exactly. And then you have the Exodus plagues, which Robinson sees as a kind of national decreation.
So focused on a specific nation, in this case, Egypt.
Right. And he argues that Pharaoh's actions, his refusal to let the Israelites go, are presented as this anti-creational force. And then, of course, that climax of the plagues with the darkness, it's like the whole creation is being returned to this primordial state, like before God said, let there be light.
Like a symbolic undoing of creation.
Exactly. And he points out that the pattern of divine command and fulfillment that we see in the plagues, it actually echoes the structure of Genesis 1.
Where God speaks and then it happens.
Right. And he even brings in Psalm 105, which explicitly links those plagues to this idea of decreation. And the order of the plagues in that psalm actually mirrors those 2 half weeks of creation in Genesis.
So we've got layers upon layers of connection here. It's like John is weaving together all these different threads from the Old Testament to paint this incredibly rich tapestry of judgment and decreation.
Exactly. And he also briefly touches on the significance of those trumpets themselves and that recurring phrase, the third.
Ah, right, because it's not just about the plagues themselves, but about how they're announced and what specific portions of creation are affected.
Exactly. So he mentions that common understanding that the 7 trumpets are probably alluding to the fall of Jericho, where they blew trumpets for 7 days, and then the city was destroyed by fire.
Yeah, that's a pretty clear connection. And of course, that 7-day period echoes the 7 days of creation. And then the fire connects to the fire that appears in those first 4 trumpets.
Right. And as for that phrase, the third, where it says a third of this is affected, a third of that, Robinson points to some potential allusions in the Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel and Zechariah.
Oh, interesting. So what do those prophets have to say about the third?
Well, in those books, the judgment of Israel often involves the destruction or sifting of a third of the people.
So it's like this recurring proportion associated with divine judgment.
Exactly. And he also highlights that the prophet Jeremiah, when he's describing the destruction of Jerusalem, he actually uses that phrase tohu wavahu, which means formless and empty.
Wait a minute, isn't that the same phrase used to describe the earth before creation in Genesis 1.2?
That's exactly it. So it's like Jeremiah is intentionally framing that destruction of Jerusalem as a kind of decreation, a return to that primordial state.
Wow, so even those historical judgments within Israel's story are being connected to this bigger idea of decreation.
Right. And it's not just Jerusalem. The burning of Jericho and the destruction of Jerusalem, those events actually frame Israel's time in the Promised Land.
Oh, wow, that's profound. So their entry into the land and their expulsion from it are both marked by these decreation events.
Exactly. It's like this cyclical pattern of creation, decreation, and then the promise of recreation.
Okay, so Robinson has built this incredibly detailed and compelling case for the Genesis connection. But I'm curious, how does he address that more traditional interpretation that focuses on the Exodus plagues?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, right? So he actually does a direct comparison of his argument to the Exodus argument.
Okay, so he's taking on the mainstream interpretation head on. What's his main point of contention?
Well, he argues that the internal textual evidence for the Genesis 1 connection is just as strong, if not stronger, than the evidence for the Exodus plagues.
Interesting. Because on the surface, it seems like the Exodus connection is more obvious.
Right. But he points out that while both interpretations share some of the same language and imagery, the trumpets actually seem to allude to all 15 of the realms and elements described in Genesis 1.
Wow, all 15. That's a lot more comprehensive than those typical 4 out of 10 plagues.